Well, we finally find ourselves in the very final portion of the book of Genesis, and it's called Vayechi, and it means and he lived or and he dwelt. And it's talking about Jacob spending the last 17 years of his life in the land of Egypt with his son Joseph, and of course the brothers are with him. And that's Genesis chapter 47, the last few verses of that chapter through the conclusion of Genesis 50. And I know for years, whenever I would think about the ending of the book of Genesis, the one thing that kind of dominated my thought is Jacob, or Israel, imparting the blessings to the 12 tribes. And I think that might be true for most people if they know much of anything about the book of Genesis. So I'm not going to talk about that so much. I don't feel like there's a lot of things that I could bring light to there, expound to, bring any more glory to it than just what it says there. There's a lot of stuff there. Like I said, that's not within my realm this morning. But I also want us to take a look at a couple of phrases in the Hebrew. We're going to take a look at a unique mirror image that exists in a relationship with Jacob and Joseph. We're also going to take a look at Ephraim and Manasseh and their relationships and where they were born and where they are. And then we're also going to take a look at how the relationship with Joseph and his brothers ended. It almost seems like in this portion, the influence of the dynamic that existed between Jacob and Esau, we find a couple instances where that seemingly kind of comes back into play or is alluded to being afraid to come back into play. So that's what we're going to take a look at. And of course, with Genesis 47, I want to draw our attention to a couple of verses. And it says, Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions there, and they multiplied exceedingly. And this is what first thing I want to throw our attention to. It talks about Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. And I like how it's on the nose specific about just how long Jacob lived in Goshen. And why do I want to bring that to our attention of all things? When we get to the Joseph saga, it really starts getting traction and really starts taking place in Genesis 37. And of course, you probably know the story just as well as I do at this point. Joseph is sent by the father Jacob to go get a report of what's going on where the brothers stand out into the field. And of course, Jesus says in the Gospels that the field is a picture of the world. And so Joseph is sent out to his brothers. Of course, they capture him, they throw him in the pit. He comes within an eyelash of losing his life because of the animosity that they hold towards him, because of the favor of their father to this particular brother. And the only thing that saves his life is the thought of they can make some coin, they can make some silver, they can make some money off of Joseph's life instead of having the bloodshed guilt put upon them. So, of course, they sell the brother Joseph for a price of a pair of shoes, and the rest is history. He goes to Egypt, he becomes a slave, he gets accused of accosting Potiphar's wife, he goes to prison, he's in prison for a few years, and then, of course, he ascends through the Egyptian royalty as a servant and becomes second in all the land. And everything that we read about the life of Joseph all starts back in Genesis 37. How old was Joseph when that account happened? Joseph was 17 years old. And so we see that Jacob was able to be a part of Joseph's life the first 17 years of his life. And then we find Joseph actually comforting his father the last 17 years that he is alive. And then, of course, in Genesis 47, Jacob says, If I have found favor in your sight, Joseph, make a promise and a vow to me that you will not bury me here in Egypt, but you will bring me back to the land, the plot in which was purchased, and bury me not in the land of bondage and restriction, of course, that we would know to be Egypt, but go bury me at Machpelah. And of course, we find Joseph later on fulfilling said desire. And then when you make your transition to Genesis 48, we see that Joseph is being told that Jacob is sick and that he's about to die and he's about to expire. And so with that being said, one of the things that happens is Joseph actually takes his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and he brings them to the presence of his father. And bear in mind, we talked about how in the first 17 years of Joseph's life, he and his father were together. After that, Jacob was in this undeniable belief that Joseph was gone. He was dead. And he never again in his whole life thought he was going to be able to rest his eyes on Joseph, that firstborn son of Rachel. And then wouldn't you know, the way life works out, he is actually able not to just see Joseph again, he is actually able to see Joseph's children. And of course, we find here that he winds up adopting Ephraim and Manasseh. And he says, basically, just as Reuben and Simeon were my first two boys, I'm adopting them as a same sort of status. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine. And I want us to take a look at verses 8 and verses 9. And we're going to take a look at some Hebrew in this, and I'm going to raise to you a couple of questions. It says, then Israel saw Joseph's sons, and he said, who are these? And of course, prior to this, he's already talking about being in the sons and meeting in the sons. And I feel that there's something deeper that this text is trying to hint at. In verse 9 it says, and Joseph said, they are my sons whom God has given me in this place. And in my Bible, there's two words in this verse, verse 9, that are in italics. And whenever you read in English translations of the Bible words that are slanted or they're in italics, it means these are words that have been added to our language for our benefit to try to make better sense of what is trying to be conveyed here in the text. And one of the things I want to share with you about this one in particular, a couple of insights. Let's take a look at Ephraim and Manasseh. Where were these two boys born? They were actually born in the land of Egypt. They weren't born in the promised land. They weren't born in the parameters of the land that God had actually promised to give Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So in a way, it's kind of like these kids in a way are Gentiles as far as the place of their birth. And I want to throw a question to you. Who was the grandfather of Ephraim and Manasseh? And I know probably the very first thing you're going to think of on that question is, it's obvious. We're reading the story, so their father is Joseph, and all three of them are already in the presence of Joseph's father, their grandfather, Jacob. And that's half true. You have to think if there's going to be, you can't just be one grandfather, there's going to be two, because there's got to be a father of the mother. Who was the father of Potipharah, Joseph's wife? You actually go into earlier texts in the book of Genesis, you'll actually find that their grandfather from Egypt was actually a priest in the land of Egypt. And here's the thing about Egypt, as you probably very well already know, they have this crazy pantheon. They have pantheons, just, it's crazy, just the absolute amount of gods that they have. You actually find in Exodus a lot of the plagues challenging the authority of these little g gods. And so, why do I make mention of that? Well, one of the reasons I make mention of that is when you go back to the generation of Jacob when he was fleeing off to Laban. It's mentioned before and even after Jacob is gone that Esau had taken these wives, that they were pagan wives from a foreign land. And it says that they were a burr under the saddle, or they were a thorn in the side to Rebekah and to Isaac. And so whenever you take a look at Joseph, who was his wife? His wife was a pagan woman. And so whenever he's asking in these two verses, 8 and 9, then Israel saw Joseph's sons, saying, who are these? The way that it reads in the Hebrew, verse 9, it reads something more similar to this. They are my sons whom God has given me with this. And so our question to that should be, what is this? And according to Rashi, who is among the elite of the rabbis in the world of Judaism, he says it makes reference to a ketubah. And a ketubah is something that we're going to talk about in the book of Exodus. A ketubah, if you're unfamiliar, is a marriage contract. And who knows if he's right about that, but I like the thoughts because it would show that the wife was brought into the fold and faith of the family of Joseph. And that these boys, even though they, in a way, are Gentiles because they're born in a foreign land, you know, they know their grandfather, who's an Egyptian priest, talks about how maybe they're brought into the fold and family of faith. And of course, Jacob adopts them in place as sons. We find later on in the book of Exodus that the Levites, with the whole debacle of the golden calf, part of their response and how they had approached the situation, they were adopted by God as a godly tribe. They were, of course, the ones who would become the priests that would deal with the people to God and God to the people. They were kind of this halfway middle management ambassador, if you will. And so, with Levi eventually being taken up as the tribe adopted by God, that would bring the 12 down to 11. And so, with the adoption of Ephraim and Manasseh, and of course, them being Joseph's children, they would slot up and take Joseph's spot, and they would take the spot of Levi, thus counterbalancing it to have a more similar 12 yet again. But I've read in a lot of commentaries, both in a way Jewish and like Christian commentary, saying that Ephraim and Manasseh, it's almost like they're a picture of Gentiles coming into the fold of faith of the God of Abraham, of the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And I do find it interesting, a dichotomy, that they have a grandfather who, their lineage with Israel, that is a beautiful lineage. And then they have the lineage of everything they witnessed in the land of Egypt, and that they're actually grandsons of priests in Egypt. And I would not be surprised in the slightest if it was one of the head priests in the land of Egypt, just because of how important that Joseph was to the culture and the community of the Egyptians at the time, because after all, he saved the dynasty from collapsing. And so, just more food for thought on that. I want us to move forward a little bit. Of course, with Genesis 48, there's more of the stuff going on with Ephraim and Manasseh. With Genesis 49, we find the blessings and Jacob's words, his last parting words to the sons. And when we get to the final concluding chapter of Genesis, chapter 50, we find that Joseph fell on his father's face, kissed him, and wept over him. And we find that there's this 40-day embalming period. Genesis is notorious for knowing, teaching that there's 40 days. And it's a time of transition. And of course, with the Egyptians, that was a time for embalming, that was a time for preparation for the afterlife. And here's what I find so unique to the situation. Talk about the absolute importance of who Joseph was to this kingdom, that whenever his father died, somebody who was indirect to Egypt, whenever Jacob died, there were 70 days that were nationwide in Egypt to mourn Jacob. And of course, Joseph winds up relating to Pharaoh, I made a promise to my father, and that promise was the fact that we're going to bury him not here, but in a plot that's a family plot. He is going to be the last of the ones that are buried at Machpelah, caves of Dublin, caves of blessing. And of course, Abraham and his wife are there. You find Isaac and Rebekah are buried there. Leah is already, I believe, buried there. And so Jacob is going to be the concluding one there. And if I have found favor in your eyes, Pharaoh, please let me speak in your hearing. My father made me swear, go bury me there. And so that's what we find unfolding. And it's not just Joseph that goes, it's all of Israel, it's their children, it's their livestock. It's like this en masse movement of people going to the burial. So much so that whenever you find that the residents who are living around Machpelah see this, they recognize that this is some great mourning from Egypt in and of itself. And so, one of the things I want to bring our attention to after that story is in verse 15. And it talks about how when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they thought perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all of the evil that we had done to him. Kind of goes back to the generation before, as I've talked about and mentioned before. Remember Jacob and Esau? They weren't always amicable with one another. As a matter of fact, as I've mentioned before, Jacob had to flee for his life because it was overheard by several members of the family, Esau saying that just as soon as my father goes down in peace, I'm putting my brother down with him in cold blood. The only reason he didn't attempt to kill Jacob was the fact that their father was still alive, and he didn't want to bring that grief upon his father, on their father. And so several years later down the line, 20 plus years it was, we find that there's this reconnection, there's this reunion between Jacob and Esau. And when Esau comes running up to Jacob, we don't know if he's going to throw him a hug or he's going to throttle him to death with his bare hands. And it's like that same attitude that overflowed in that generation from the mothers also overflowed from those brothers down to Jacob's children. And so it talks about how they actually sent a messenger, they sent to Joseph. Messengers is another word that's kind of in italics, so maybe not. But it says that they sent to Joseph saying, hey, before dad died, He asked us, remember your brothers. I know they did some shoddy things, some pretty crappy things. We apologize for that. We ask an oversight, just bear with them a little bit of grace. Please don't repay them evil. And here's the thing, we don't know if Jacob ever really truly knew what happened in the fallout in the sons from Genesis 37 up to the point of his death. The way it makes it sound, the brothers could have fabricated yet another story. In a way, they kind of fabricated a situation or a story to their father back then. They might be fabricating a story now. I don't really know that we know that for sure. I feel like if it was absolute public knowledge of what the brothers had done to Joseph, I feel Pharaoh might have actually taken action as much as he admired and took Joseph up. He might not have given Joseph the option of what he wanted to do with the brothers. He might have taken care of it himself. And so, an interesting thought. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. It broke his heart. And it says, the brothers also went and fell down before his face and said, behold, we are your servants. And again, going back to Genesis 37, whenever they decided to sell him as a slave, we put our lives and put ourselves in the same situation as we put you in. You are above us. We're sorry. And Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant for it as good, in order to bring it about, as it is this day, to save many people alive. There are still people on the face of this planet. This kingdom is still strong and it's not fallen. And even though you wanted to kill me and you wanted to bring me down, the collapse of the life of Joseph would have had this tsunami tide just tearing into the Egyptian kingdom even, and it would have faltered. It would have had corruption. But we find that with Joseph, his name means added to. We see not only just the fact that people survived, we see generations that thrived. We find people that had blessings added to their lives. And I want us to bring our attention to verse 21. It says, now therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And the back half is really where we're going to have the emphasis. And he comforted them and he spoke kindly to them. You can still speak kindly to someone and an individual, even if you've had it up to your ears with them and you want to throttle their neck. I can think of several times in my life, whether it be going through my schooling, whether it be through workplace, family situations, you are just absolutely aggravated and you've got steam just blowing out of your ears. But you can still have the option to speak kindly to them. But I do not think that that was the case with Joseph. And here's what I mean by that. When it comes to biblical Hebrew, you're dealing with approximately 7,800 unique words. And so the way that we translate them in English, and I don't think it's a bad translation, but I really don't think we got to the epicenter of the heartbeat of heaven in those wordings. In Hebrew, it's Vaydaber Alavim. It literally says, he spoke to their hearts. And there's a piece of advice that was given to me years ago by my pastor in the ministry. And as I've mentioned before, I was 16 years old when I started preaching back in 2008. And I was at that congregation all the way until January 2021. And I wound up having to discontinue that just because of a sudden job situation. And during that time, my pastor in the ministry, Don, had told me and gave me this invaluable piece of advice. And he says, when you speak from the mind, you speak to the mind. It's great having intellectual conversations. It's really good sharing facts about scripture and individuals. You can really get some stimulating conversations going. But when you speak from the mind, you speak to the mind. But whenever you speak from your heart, that is when you speak to their hearts. And it makes me think of the book of John when it talks about how you had all of these religious elite that were among the presence of Christ. It says that Jesus even told them, you search the scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life. But you're wrong. It's they, the scriptures, that testify of me. It's not just about intellectual stimulation. It's about penetrating the heart and the spirit of the individual and making that godly connection, not a connection in the flesh, but a connection of the spirit. And when it says here, literally in the Hebrew, that Joseph spoke to their hearts, that shows a lot to me about this situation. Because Joseph was put in some ultimately horrible situations. But he had the spiritual maturity of him to know that God was able to basically convert every evil, every harm, every whisper into this shining example that Joseph was a servant in the hand of God to keep very much people alive. And as I've mentioned before, the same word for servant in Hebrew also could mean son. What does a son do? And I don't mean like a child, like Gavin is my child, he's my son. I mean sun like in the sky, S-U-N. It gives you warmth. It gives you light. And I really feel that Joseph was fulfilling both of those, just in who he was. There is a way that God is able to use you in multi-dimensional ways, not just one dimension. Whenever we read text, it's not just talking about what it's talking about. There's something more. There's a spiritual level to this on how God is acting and how God is using. And the more that we are aware of that, I feel God can really truly do more because we are trying to align ourselves with the heartbeat of heaven. And a couple final thoughts before we wrap up the book of Genesis here. It says, Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. What is interesting here is that there's only one other individual who is noted in Scripture, the entirety of the Bible, New Testament, Old Testament alike, to have died at 110 years of age, and that is none other than Joshua. You see, with Joseph, he brought the people into the fold, into the land of Egypt. Joseph was like this seed, if you will. But we find that Joseph was the seed that went to the land of Egypt. And that seed grew and became bigger. We find that he had a family. We find that his family comes to the land of Egypt. And Egypt almost served as this womb, if you will, to help grow and nourish Israel, this people that were going to be brought apart by God, that they were set apart, they were sanctified. And after this certain amount of time, we find that there's these signs, we find that these wonders happen in Egypt. And when you study the dichotomy of all the plagues, it's like they happen in three groups of three. It's almost like there's these trimesters, if you will, before there is the last and final one, which is unfortunately the death of the firstborn. But with the death of the firstborn, we find the release of God's firstborn son, as he says in Scripture, that they are released from Egypt, this place that is a bondage of restriction. It's the same wording as a child in the womb. That they are released from the land of Egypt, that they cross the sea, and in this sea there's the breaking of waters, and that they are birthed into the other side, a nation totally dependent upon God. And we find the man who brought them there, Joseph, that his bones leave Egypt, and that they are brought into the promised land by the man, the only other man, Joshua, whose name means salvation, that he brings them into the promised land. Interesting how all that works out. And so we find that happening with Joseph there. And I want us to look at the closing let's look at the closing 3 verses in the book of Genesis. Because this is going to be the last image that you see, that you find before the credits roll on the book of Genesis. And it says, and Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob. And here are the last 2 verses. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you. You shall carry up my bones from here. That is the last quotation given to us by anybody from the book of Genesis. And it says, so Joseph died being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. How beautiful is it that the very last thing that's mentioned and said by anybody in Genesis is to take my bones and leave here. And why do I make a big emphasis on that? Because whenever we get to the Gospel of Matthew, we find that when Jesus is being crucified, there's somebody who asks for his body. And it's a man by the name of Joseph from Arimathea. And whenever Jesus is crucified, he's killed. He's given to Joseph, and he is placed in the tomb of Joseph. But it's interesting because by the time that you get to the credits rolling in the book of Matthew, you actually find that Jesus' body is gone. We find that the tomb of Joseph is empty. Whenever you go read in the book of Exodus, we find that Joseph in Genesis, his tomb is left empty. When you get to the book of Mark, Jesus is crucified. He's placed in a tomb of the man of the name Joseph of Arimathea. We find that that tomb is empty. Wouldn't you know, by the time you read the book of Luke, it's the same thing. And with the book of John, same exact thing. That in the first book of the book of books, it ends with the tomb of Joseph promised to be made empty at a time of the Exodus, when the people are freed from the sin, when the people are freed from their bondage. I think that is a prophecy that is so often overlooked. And with this man Joseph in the book of Genesis, naturally, he was a man of dreams. He had dreams himself. He interpreted dreams. And I find it no mistake that whenever Jesus was born and began to do the works and wonders, he was raised by a man who was named Joseph. I've mentioned before, even with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Essene community, they said there would be this servant who was going to come, a Messiah, who was going to suffer, that he was going to be betrayed by his brethren, but he would heal the sick, he would heal the blind, he would heal the heartbroken and the wounded, that he was going to come and serve the people. And they called him the suffering Messiah, the son of Joseph. And so I hope that you've been blessed as we have gone through the book of Genesis these last couple of months. And we will be going more in detail, obviously, through also with the book of Exodus. And so if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to reach out. And until such time, thank you and be blessed.